We wanted
Fantastic.
to make sure. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce, so this way this is going to work is I'm going to introduce our panelists. After that, they will take 5 minutes to talk about their life experience, and then we will have the question and answer time. The order is going to be Reverend Sharon Coe, Reverend Pamela Lee, Reverend Rashard Austin, and then myself. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Reverend Sharon Coe. Reverend Coe is grateful to be serving as the Executive Director and CEO of American Baptist International Ministries. Her passion for God's mission is unmistakable and contagious, and she is usually looking for ways that we all of us, can work together to bring God's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. She had 15 years of pastoral experience, and that gave her a breadth of experience and leadership before she stepped into the role of CEO at International Ministries. She has shaped the minds, and she has a sharp mind and a passionate heart, and she works very hard towards excellence in all she does. You will enjoy her approachable personality, and I can say that as one who has experienced it, an infectious sense of humor. Her interests include traveling, photography, and food from many different cultures. And I will also say, once again, on a personal level, that International Ministries has gone through a lot of changes over these last few years, and I believe that Reverend Coe has done an excellent job in leading International Ministries at what has been a difficult time. And so I just wanted to add that as well. Next, well, actually, could you just say hello, Reverend Coe?
Hello, greetings. It's good to be together with all of you. I see Greg Hemmen. I see Board Director Reverend Ivan Gruder. Really honored to be here. Thanks for being together and inviting me.
Next, we're going to have Reverend Pamela Lee. Reverend Lee is licensed and ordained minister. She has been such since 2008. She and her husband, Dr. H. David Lee, pastored the Watonga Indian Baptist Church in Watonga, Oklahoma. Prior to this, she and her husband were the co-pastors of Vino Nuevo Bilingual Church in South Oklahoma City. They continue to oversee that church. Pastor Pamela has served as communion minister, altar and intercessory prayer minister, teacher in children's church, teen and adult Bible study. She has led that Bible study at All Nations Champions Church and Citadel of Praise World Outreach Center, both of which are in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Pastor Pamela is the founder and the president of Glory to Glory Ministries Incorporated, a 501c3 since 2013, which is a benevolence ministry with an emphasis on prayer and conducting spiritual support groups. Also, she has served as the chair of religious affairs for the Oklahoma State NAACP. In her secular career, she has worked for the Oklahoma State Department of Human Services Welfare Agency, the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority Medicaid Agency, the Oklahoma State Department of Health, where she retired as a public information officer in May 2015. Early in her career, she worked for the local CBS affiliate KWTV Channel 9 as a writer, producer, and public service director. Pastor Lee received her bachelor's degree in mass communication and journalism from Oklahoma City University and received her master's degree in public health administration and policy from the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center College of Public Health. Could you say hello to us, Reverend Lee?
Oh, yes, hello. Blessings to everyone and your families, and thank you for inviting me.
And next, we have Pastor Rashard Austin. This is his 15th year as a Kansan, and he's currently pastoring First Baptist Church of Hutchinson, Kansas. Now, he's going to have a major change in his life in the next few weeks. He's going to be moving from being a lifelong bachelor to being an instant family man. And so we congratulate him on that. Prior to First Baptist of Hutchinson, he worked at Sterling College in Sterling, Kansas for 13 years in a variety of different capacities as a professor, coach, maintenance worker, assistant resident director, and convergent technology specialist. He spent 3 years in the Chicagoland area while attending Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where he still has not completed his degree because of the lack of field education credit. And I'm wondering if pastoring qualifies as field education. During his time in Chicagoland, he had the privilege of working for God's chosen people, as a housing and groundsman for Benai Torah Synagogue, comprised of over 250 families. This is one of the most treasured experiences of his life. He has, other than serving in the United States Air Force Reserves right out of high school. He's looking forward to the challenge of being a great husband, wonderful father, and faithful shepherd. Pastor Austin, will you say hello to us?
And hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion this evening.
And you have all already met me. I am Franklin Ruff. I have the privilege of being the teaching pastor here at First Baptist Stillwell. And I will talk a little bit more about how this came into being. This was originally supposed to just be a discussion between myself and First Baptist Stillwell, predominantly because I am an African-American pastor who has the privilege of pastoring a church that is predominantly Anglo-European. And it was a discussion that needed to be had. Well, that ended up expanding. And as it expanded, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is because in the media at this particular point in time, this is framed as a conversation between white Americans and Black Americans. But the fact of the matter is that this issue of racism is an issue that touches more than two populations. And the conversation needed to be expanded. We need to bring our other brothers and sisters who have also suffered from this injustice into the conversation. Our Asian brothers and sisters, our Native American brothers and sisters, our Hispanic brothers and sisters, and others. At one point, we had intended on having some members from our native churches in Oklahoma speak, but unfortunately, their schedules did not allow for it. So unfortunately, we won't be able to do that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to simply move into our speakers. They're going to take 5 minutes to talk about their life and their experience, and then we're going to move directly into our question and answer. So first up, we will have Reverend Sharon Coe.
Well, hello and good evening. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, First Baptist Stillwell and the Central Region American Baptist Churches. A little bit about myself. I am a missionary kid. So I was born in Singapore. We moved when I was 1 right away to the Philippines. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I had been to 10 different schools in different locations. So living cross-culturally was somewhat normal for me. And all of the mission experience that goes with not being able to speak the language and being in a foreign country and those kinds of things were a big part of my childhood. For the purposes of this conversation, the 2 points where racism touched my life, most of my grade school years were spent in Columbus, Ohio, where my brother and I were the only Asians in the school. And I received some of the teasing, but I think I was more angered by the things I would hear said to my younger brother. I would come out to the playground at recess and find kids standing around him saying pretty mean things, and kind of the older sister instinct would kick in and just kind of, go away, stop, and then, as grade school kids sometimes do, get into fist fights, come back with a bloody nose, and try to explain to your parents why you got into a fist fight over something someone said to your little brother. That was one of the early experiences when racism touched my life in adulthood. Race is an interesting thing, and we'll certainly talk more about it. But in Asia, Singapore, where my parents are from, I was raised basically at this point more than half my life in the United States. Los Angeles is where I consider myself from, even though I've been living in so many different places. But racism is interesting because in 2011, I was a mission pastor in Los Angeles, and a tsunami, triple threat earthquake destroyed Japan. If you remember, starting from the East Coast over. A lot of people in my church really felt that, took that to heart and wanted to go help. And I'm Chinese, I'm of Chinese descent. Several generations ago, if you remember, it was the Japanese that tried to march across most of Asia. So word got back to my family in Singapore that I was spending a lot of time volunteering in Japan. It was very frowned upon. I have two uncles that died as children in the war. One of my aunts told me not to tell my other aunt where I was because she hates Japan so much she won't even buy something made in Japan. I mean, just things I didn't even know about myself, about my own family. And the rest of the world looks at us and says, you guys can't see it. You all have the same ancestors. You walk down and say, my best friend is Japanese, right? If you met us, you wouldn't be able to tell us. You wouldn't be able to tell us which one was Chinese, which one was Japanese. But just one generation ago, literally my parents' generation, they won't even speak to each other. So these are some of the points where racism has touched my life over the years. And without wanting to go way into, I don't want to waste too much time on my history because I feel like there's more exciting things to talk about here. But thoughts on reconciliation. One of the best illustrations I've heard about Genesis chapters 1 through 3, when each of us, man and woman, all made in the image of God, is that it was like God took a mirror and he held it up and he saw his own image. And then somebody knocked that mirror out of his hand and it fell to the ground and it shattered into a million pieces. And each one of us is like one of those shards. And without your piece and your piece and your piece and your piece and your piece, I cannot get a full picture of the image of God. So reconciliation is not just that nice thing that we should do, or the thing that we should do because it brings a little bit of lack of violence or a little bit more peace. Reconciliation, I believe, is biblically motivated by, unless we do this, we've been entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation, but unless we do this, we cannot fully understand all the many facets of the person of God. And so I can and I should absolutely expect that when I get to heaven, and Jesus taught us to pray on earth as it is in heaven, that there should be people at the table who look different from me. And so that's kind of my thoughts on reconciliation and a bit about myself.
Thank you very much, Reverend Coe. Next, we're going to have comment from Pastor Pamela Lee.
Okay, thank you again for inviting me, everyone. And I was actually born in San Francisco, California. My dad was in the Army, but we grew up in Great Bend, Kansas. Hello, everybody.
Okay.
And I went to Park Elementary School in Great Bend, Kansas, and my dad has been a minister in Kansas, Reverend Albert Robinson. Robinson's my maiden name. So then we moved from there to Oklahoma City because my mother's family is from here. You've heard my bio, so to try to be a little more personal, I first experienced discrimination, I think, was in kindergarten because I didn't know I was Black. So I just went to school, you know, and then someone called me a name and I said, what's that? You know, so I had to go back home and ask, what's that? You know, which ended up in a parent teacher conference and the principal and everybody. So we got through that, you know, and my father was with NAACP in Kansas for a little while, Great Bend. So I remember as a child, him helping to integrate the public accommodations, the theater. Of course, as a kid, I only remember the movie theater, you know, but I remember that. And we just didn't really seem to have that many racial problems as I see when I moved to Oklahoma. It was, to me, a lot more racist in the atmosphere. It seemed to be a lot more segregated, you know, Blacks on one side of town, whites on the other side. The schools were segregated. So in high school, I became part of the group that integrated the Oklahoma City public school system in the 9th grade, okay? And was told to look out for your little sisters, which that was not easy to do, you know? And so went through all of that and the bomb threats and the death threats. And but I will say out of that experience that even today I have Facebook friends that are of all different races. So the non-Black kids that were willing to be called names also and go through all of that trauma, well, basically we're still friends on Facebook, okay? And I don't know that anybody can say they still have friends from elementary school and high school, you know. After all these years, I am 65. So been through a little bit of things, you know. As the NAACP religious chair with my husband here for the state of Oklahoma, we started a project called Unity in Our Community. Several years ago, back in about 2015, 2016, and I can talk about that later if someone's interested in that. So we did go around to different churches talking about that, knowing there was a lot of racial unrest in the United States and trying to get the churches involved, at least to think in terms of what can I do in my community to bring unity between the races. Is there a project or is there something that the community needs that our church can step into and help with? So that's a project we worked on. And then in the Native American church, I'm just learning a lot of cultural things. A lot of things in their culture are very subtle. You have to be careful not to really step on toes sometimes. You know, you need to take your time and listen, you know. And in the Hispanic community, I speak very little Spanish, some from high school and college, but I always had to walk around with a translator. So I would grab the kids, you know, the elementary kids, and people's grandkids, everything. Hey, come translate for me, you know. And that worked out pretty well, actually. And some of them are still translating now in their teens, you know, and it gave them another skill set, so to speak, you know. And I think that when I worked in the Oklahoma State Department of Human Rights, I was in Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. So I worked for the Human Rights Agency there, and I was trained by EEOC. So I was able to learn a lot of things in Minnesota. At that time, Minnesota was a lot more progressive in a lot of ways than a lot of the other states. So I did get ahead of the curve before I moved back to Oklahoma City in terms of race relations. So, and I think that's about all I can really say. My thing is you have to listen. You have to learn to listen and respect each other and respect each other's opinions, your cultures, and your differences. But the main thing is people talk, but they don't listen. And that's something that I've kind of learned. So, I think that's enough about me.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Lee. And next, we're going to have the pastor of First Baptist Hutchinson, Kansas, Pastor Rashad Austin.
Well, I was raised on about 120-acre plot in small town, East Coast, North Carolina, a little place called Ellaby, North Carolina, by my grandparents, who were very strict disciplinarians, very structured, and I like to say that they loved me enough to beat foolishness out of me and loved me enough to beat some kind of wisdom into me. They were very strict disciplinarians, loved me enough to be very consistent in that discipline. They basically told me four things pretty much my entire life: work hard, treat people right, save your money, and don't make any excuses. And I really don't, still to this day at 46 years old, I don't see any problem with that. I think you couple that with a biblical worldview and you pretty much have your all-American or all-world, at least practical perspective. And I really appreciate my grandparents for that. Very simple, very straightforward. They were very much committed to their marriage and to their families, even though they had their, they had their issues, they had their dysfunction, but they were unwilling to relent on being responsible to one another and being responsible for the children that they made, and being responsible for the children that their children made, even when their children weren't being responsible for them. So I really, really appreciate my grandparents in that regard. As far as racism is concerned, I think I basically, I hate to make a big broad generalization, but some generalizations are there because there's some nuance of truth to it. I mean, I've experienced a fair share of, just blatant kind of, dare I use the word, profiling by law enforcement agencies. However, you just kind of roll with the punches. I've always just kind of seen that as par for the course. It's nothing that I take personally. I just take it. There's a reason they're profiling. Interestingly enough, the first day I got to Kansas, the first day within the first 3 hours, I got pulled over. I was like, welcome to Kansas. This is amazing. So that was a lot of fun. But again, I've never taken it personally. It's just kind of par for the course, when I moved to Oklahoma from North Carolina, I was in the 8th grade, and my mom was like, hey, we're leaving. I lived in what I call the pre-ghetto kind of area. We weren't full-blown ghetto, but really close. Violence, drugs, prostitution, always looking over your shoulder, just a lot of really bad stuff. But it taught me a lot. It taught me a tremendous amount, and I think credit my grandparents to giving me kind of the intestinal fortitude to be able to navigate through that without making some very poor decisions. We moved to Oklahoma, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma to be specific, and that was the first time I experienced like blatant, in my own experience, like blatant racism. Like I really knew, oh, yes, they're throwing rocks at me because I'm black. Like that was the first time. Other than that, profiling happens, whatever, that just kind of happens. I didn't really, I guess you could say, cognitively understand, oh, this is racism. It was just kind of like, well, that's what happens. But the first time I really understood what was happening, I was like, oh, wow. So yeah, they're throwing rocks at me, calling me names because I'm black. And that happened fairly regularly, I would say, from 8th grade to 12th grade. When I moved to Broken Arrow, go back to Africa Jigaboo, kind of stuff like that. It happened pretty regularly. So I'd say that's just kind of blatant racism. But again, my grandparents' upbringing, along with, I think, a biblical worldview, gave me more of an empathetic response than a violent response. It was interesting because my white friends, dare I use that terminology, they would go do violence on my behalf. It was really weird. I said, no, don't go do anything. Hey, no, don't. And they would go vandalize people's cars that would call me names. It was really odd to see that kind of stuff. But that's when I really experienced blatant racism, was when I moved to Oklahoma from the East Coast. And as far as race relations today, I might have somewhat of an unpopular perspective. For all practical purposes, as I currently understand it and trying to think through it, I feel like a lot of it's, overhyped chaos. I mean, it's stoked fanaticism and it's prostituted for the betterment of individuals, corporations, or particular political agendas, which I know is probably not a very popular response. There are racist issues in our country, obviously, and throughout the world. Our current climate, though, as I have currently perceive it and understand it, it seems to be more of an issue that is being used rather than an issue that is addressed to better our country or better our particular race relations as we see them today. And thoughts on reconciliation, particularly, what does that look like? And I just don't know. I thought about the question quite a bit. I've always been a little puzzled by, what should my response be as far as reconciliation from a biblical perspective? Obviously, I think we'd all agree that it's reconciliation first to Christ regardless of race and ethnic heritage. After that, you know, what does it look like? Or do we have a denominational stance? Do we have churches that take particular stances on particular issues to reconcile certain differences, whether it be race or otherwise? But I struggle with that question a lot as far as what is the church's position, or what position should it take to be a good stewardship of its resources and its primary calling of reconciling people to Christ and proclaiming the truth of the gospel. Outside of that reconciliation, you know, what is the church's, what is an appropriate, wise, intentional, strategic approach for the church collective, not the church individual, to take towards reconciliation? So I'm really curious and excited to see what the thoughts are tonight, because I struggle with that a lot personally, as far as wanting to guard against the church being co-opted into a social justice mechanism and forgetting its primary calling of reconciling and proclaiming the truth of the gospel, and primarily looking to reconcile people to God. Yes, there is, I think, a responsibility of sorts, but very often I think we get co-opted into issues other than proclaiming the gospel, and we forget maybe the gospel message, and we focus a lot on maybe social issues to some degree. So I'm really curious to see what we popcorn up this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Pastor Austin. And so I guess that leaves me. And so I'm going to do this in basically 3 parts. I'm going to give you a brief, quick history, and then talk about my experience in terms of what I have seen in terms of racism, and then we'll talk about reconciliation. Now, I was raised in Detroit, Michigan. I lived in a house with my mom and my grandparents. And one thing that my grandparents always instilled in me is that I am never at any point allowed to use my race as an excuse for lack of success. If you don't succeed, there may be some other reasons, but you are not allowed to use your race as a reason for lack of success. So take into consideration that singular lesson is something that has been with me for all of my life. And my grandparents, of course, they grew up in a segregated America. And so it had nothing to do with lack of understanding. That was just, especially my grandfather, that was his teaching. You do it, you work hard, and sometimes it happens, sometimes it don't, but you're not allowed to use race. I also growing up in Detroit, grew up in a city where the majority of the people looked like me, including the people in power. The mayor looked like me. The chief of police looked like me. The majority of the police department looked like me. And so my experience in racism really early on was not something that I physically experienced. I heard about it because there was always the talk about the suburbs. Right? There was an interesting relationship in Detroit in the 80s and 90s between the city, which was 90% African American, and the suburbs. Because in the early 60s, there was a flight of white Americans out of the city into the suburbs. And of course, the city at that point became a majority Black city. My first actual experience that I can remember with racism actually happened as a teenager. My grandmother made it perfectly clear that, again, some of those suburbs you don't go into, especially after dark. And I was 17 and I'm going to do what I want to do. And we got pulled over. Now, admittedly, I did what the officer said that I did, but so did the 3 cars in front of me, which just so happened to not have a load, because I think it was about 5 of us, of African-American teenagers. And the attitude that the officer displayed was troubling to me as a teenager. But I will say that with the exception of that one instance. My experience with law enforcement is every time I've gotten pulled over, I've done what they pulled me over for. And quite frankly, a few times being a pastor has gotten me out of a ticket. So I can't complain about that. I went to seminary in Ashland, Ohio. And so my first experience in ministry was all urban inner city churches. And then for some reason, and I understand the reason now, God calls this 30-something-year-old African-American male with 10 years of ministry experience in the urban inner city to Greensburg, Kansas, population 730. Just to let you know, my neighborhood that I grew up in, Detroit, had more than 730 people. But that experience taught me something. It taught me that not only that we all have biases, including myself, and going into that community, a community of 730, where the African-American population consisted of my wife and myself and my children once we adopted them, taught me one of some biases that I had about rural America, some biases that I had about white rural America. I also saw biases that they had and perceptions that they had about this Black pastor that was coming from what they perceived as the big city. And we were able to overcome those. We were able to sit down and have conversations. I was in Greensburg during the time that Ferguson happened, and we were able to have conversations over why policing appeared to be different in rural 730-person Greensburg and Wichita, Kansas. And after a time of ministry in Greensburg, I was called here to Stillwell, and this is where I currently serve. Now let's talk about my perception of racism. I see racism in three ways. One is overt racism. Overt racism is dangerous, but it's also easy to fight and it's easy to overcome because you can see it. Everyone can see it. It's right there, it's in your face. And while there are dangers to that, once again, that is something that you see coming. And so you're able, it's a lot easier to defend against that. Then there is systemic racism. And my biggest issue with even using that term is that we seem to live in a time when every system is considered to be racist. And that is just patently untrue. Are there things within certain systems that might have racial tone to them? Absolutely. But then I go back to my grandfather. I can't use that as an excuse. To me, the most dangerous form of racism is what I call the racism of low expectation. And this is a racism that I have seen since I was a child. It's a racism that says that we need to change standards for African Americans and for Native and for Hispanics because they cannot achieve at the same level. It is a racism that says that Harvard requires Asian Americans to score a higher score than everyone else to get into Harvard. That is not considered racist, but if you think about it, if we just think about the definition of what racism is, that is racism. And that is what troubles me the most because I've got 3 boys and I don't want any of them to be in a situation where they're wondering, am I really good enough to do this job? Or was I really good enough to get into this school? Or am I simply here because they needed to meet a quota? Am I simply here? Did they lower the standards? Did I not meet the same standard that everyone else met because of the color of my skin? To me, in America today, that type of racism is the most dangerous type of racism because it lowers expectations for an entire group of people, and it gets us to the point where we may think that we are achieving greater than we really are because someone thought that they were doing us a favor by lowering expectations. I want to have to meet the same expectations that everyone else has to meet. I don't want them lowered. I don't want to have to meet a greater expectation. I want to be able to meet the same. But we are in a time today when that is not always the case. And to me, that is the racism that is most dangerous, because you don't see it. And in many cases, it's not considered racism. So for me, that is what I want to fight against the most. I don't worry about overt racism. I can see that coming. I'm not as worried about systemic racism, because over time systems change. But that racism of low expectations, I believe, is extremely dangerous for my community, and it's extremely dangerous for my children. So with that, we will enter into a time of question and answers. I'm pretty sure in listening to all of us that some of you have had some questions. So the way we're going to do this, there are a few questions that have come in ahead of time, and we're going to ask those. And as we get through those, in the chat feature, you will be able to do one of two things. You can type the word question. If you type the word question, that means that you want to verbally ask your question, and we will call on you. Or you can simply type your question in the chat feature, and Pastor Jessica will read it off. If you have a specific person that you want to answer that question, just put their name and the question, and they will answer it. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. Jessica, first question.
Thank you all so much for sharing. The first question, some of you have already touched on, but if you would just take a moment and expand a little bit more. Some of you touched on when the first time was that you realized racism or discrimination existed. And if you want to touch on that a little bit more, you can. But do you feel like that is better, much better, a little better, about the same, or worse than it was for your parents or your grandparents?
And anyone who wants can jump right in.
Oh, okay. I'll say something, I guess, first, since I've seen several generations. I would say it's better than it was in my parents' time, because my mother wanted to be a registered nurse, and she could not go to school in Oklahoma to be a registered nurse. She went to Kansas. So she met my dad in Great Bend, Kansas. Okay. So the nuns had a school there, the Catholics, they had a school where they would allow other races to come train to be nurses. So, I mean, that's a big improvement. Just being able to access services better, you know, and education too. I am encouraged by the protests today, because I see more races out there protesting than I did in the 60s. Okay, so I was out there in the 60s, you know, and so I feel like the baton is passed, and it's up to the younger generation. We're here to guide and reflect and try to provide, you know, answer questions if we can, but it really is up to this younger generation to take that baton and move forward, okay? And you have better tools to work with than we did. And also my daughter grew up in integrated schools, so she got friends of all races. You know, I mean, they still talk, and she's right now studying to be a chiropractor, you know, doctor. So, I mean, yes, things are a lot better now, for us anyway, in that respect. I do see education as a way out of poverty, and I see poverty as a big problem too, that's linked with discrimination. There's economic issues involved there. They keep you from living in the neighborhood you necessarily want to live in, to go to the school you want to go to, or whatever, you know, those opportunities. But yeah, I would say that things are better, because now my sister and my daughter and all of her friends are out there, you know, demonstrating. Well, she can't now because she's in school, but you know, but they kind of push each other up and encourage each other. they're not afraid to talk to each other, which my generation didn't talk, you know, but they talk to each other. They go to lunch, they go out together. Just, you know, it's a different atmosphere, you know. And probably if we old people would get out of the way, you know, we could probably get a little more progress here with young people. So I encourage youth ministry. That's all.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that question? Okay, what's the next one there, Pastor Jessica? You're muted. Pastor Jessica, you're muted.
My apologies. The question is, do you view the most recent struggles we've been having as a nation as a deterioration of race relations or as a continuation of the struggle in making progress?
Anybody want to take a stab at that one? Do you see what's going on currently as a deterioration, or do you see it as a continuation? Okay, well, I'll do it, and I'm going, and Pastor Austin, if I'm off base a little bit, you come in and correct me, because I think you and I might have a similar viewpoint on this. I see a lot, not all, but I see a lot of the struggle that we see going on now, especially the part that we see in the media. I don't see it either way. I see it as opportunists who are using certain things that happen in the media to further their own agendas. And the reason that I would say that is because if you look at communities are diverse. We aren't, even in the African American community, we aren't a monolith. We have different ways of thinking, different ways of doing things, but all of these issues seem to revolve around a similar political agenda and going in the same direction. And the biggest issue that I see is that there needs to be someone or some group of someones, like during the time of the civil rights movement, that says this is what we want. And then there needs to be a semi-unified voice that says this is what we want. And I don't think we have that right now. So I don't see it as a deterioration. I don't see it as a progress. I see it, quite frankly, for the most part, not totally, as an opportunist.
And I would second that sentiment. I do think, as much as I don't like to use the word, I think it's very applicable. So pardon my use of it. I feel like race relations have been prostituted in a large degree. They've been stoked and used to push other agendas. It doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't work to be done with race relations in our country. I really appreciated Sharon Coe's perspective. She was able to briefly give us a little bit of that. That immediately just kind of struck a chord in me and helped me realize the narrowness of my perspective. So I really appreciate her sharing a little bit of her story there. So there's definitely some perspective to be gained for all of us. But our current struggles, I think it'd be very hard, at least for me, to pinpoint exactly what the struggle is unless I look at myself first. Like, unless I look at the Black community first. I can pinpoint the struggle there, and many of you, I think because you're here tonight, are probably aware of these things. And even though they might be most, how would you say, recognizable in Black America, I think all cultures struggle with a lack of responsible male leadership in the home, a lack of men standing up and taking responsibility for their choices and their families and their children. A lack of people being personally responsible for themselves and their choices and looking for solutions that are more, I think, used to increase dependency versus personal dignity. I can point at those struggles specifically when it comes to race or personal responsibility, but to me, it's a very difficult question. Like, is it a little of both and a mix of other things? Like, is it partially the idea of deterioration of race relations, or are they just more recognizable now because people are so stoked and infuriated? Maybe they've always been there and they're just more visible now. Is it a continuation of the struggle making progress? Man, Black America is probably historically, I can't give you statistics, but probably historically have come from the furthest down and come the furthest ahead in this country. Like, if you look how far Black people were behind and how far Black people have come, it's pretty amazing in this country. Not to say that there aren't obstacles that non-Black people might not have, or sure, we can look at that more closely. It's a tough question. I'm sorry, I can't give more clarity there. It's a tough question. I think it's maybe those two things plus more things that we could identify. But I think for me and my current understanding approach, it starts with the individual. I really, again, I agree with you totally, Reverend Ruff, that the color of my skin is not an excuse. It's not an excuse.
The others on the panel want to take a stab at that question. Is the current struggle racial deterioration, or is it progress? Okay. Well, I'm looking here and it looks like we have a question from Don and Carol. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, we're listening.
All right, thank you. My question is for Sharon. I think unquestionably in the United States, the black-white issue has been an issue of white supremacy, that all of the white people hold themselves above the blacks. On a more worldwide level, where you have been, a more international level, is that true? Like you mentioned Chinese and Japanese people. Do each of them hold themselves superior to the other, or is there some kind of tradition in other cultures and other races where one culture does hold themselves superior to the other?
Wow, that is a deep and very loaded question, Don. I appreciate the way that you framed it. I think my immediate and instinctive answer is absolutely. Everybody thinks they're the best. And, every village you go to, every city you go to, every town you go to, every culture you go to, they will be glad to tell you why theirs is the best and superior to all of their neighbors. And I believe that at the core of our human fallen brokenness is the desire to keep the other as the other. And there are plenty of good examples in scripture. Many of the stories, once you cast the color of the people in the story into it as well, they become a lot more obvious. We've had a lot of conversations about the Samaritans and the mixed races and those kinds of things. But when I think about like my travels in, say, Africa, if you're not from this tribe, you're not from that tribe, then you're just better off. You don't have a belonging. You don't have a citizenship. You don't belong here. So it's not just a black and white issue. Largely in the United States, that has been historically our history. But golly, as I sometimes say to my staff, none of us get up in the morning and look at ourselves in the mirror and say, oh, you know what, I'm a racist. And, none of us think that. But that closedness of mind to not be able to not be willing to consider, what did I just assume about, the person that I just passed, or the person who, I don't know, cleaned my car, or the person I passed at the grocery store, one way or the other. Did I assume one was superior? Did I assume one was inferior? Did I have that in me? if I am unwilling to even challenge my own presuppositions, then I lack the humility that Christ desires in me to consider others better than ourselves, right? There's the echoing of Philippians 2. And I think there is a place in God's kingdom for positive pride, just kind of look, here are the great things that my culture and I bring to the table. But I think the place where that becomes damaging and where sin touches that is when we let ourselves get to the place where it's, and you have nothing to offer, is when we allow ourselves to get to that. And it should be, in a sense, here's a thing that I bring, to the potluck, so to speak, and here's a thing that you bring to the potluck, and let's share and let's taste and let's sample and let's get to know, and let's enjoy each other's culture. So yeah, I think in every part of the world, I can't think of a place that it's not true. Racism exists, and I see it as part of the fall.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question to that, at some point in time or during a period of time, did the African American people buy in to that subserviency?
Gosh.
And I think this is more of a, not specifically directed at you, Sharon, but I certainly would like to hear your answer. But, it seems to me that other cultures and other races have had discrimination against one another because they feel they're superior. It seems to me that, especially during slave times, that it's almost like, from my perspective, that the Black people bought into that maybe they were subservient, maybe they were less for so many years, or were they just gentle enough to accept? I don't know. It's hard for me to understand how the Black people must have felt, even now, but particularly during the time of slavery.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll jump right in and say I'm the wrong person to answer that question. but I will say that I think in the Asian American culture there is some of that.
Yeah.
There is a certain kind of assumption that you have to work harder. Your parents are frequently, it's assumed that they don't speak very good English, that they're not educated. I remember being in Walmart as a child, and the person that checked us out, said to my mother, "That will be $4.72." And I must have been 6 years old. I just said, she speaks English, and she's not hard of hearing. So let me let your question, let me allow someone else to answer that question. But I do think the Asian American culture has some of that you sort of expect to be second to the table, so you don't answer the question first. I caught myself doing that earlier. And, the question is for somebody else, and when they're all done, then I'll answer it. I think there's some of that in the culture, in the Asian American culture.
That was an excellent input. I agree with that, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, let me allow someone else to answer his question.
Yeah, I mean,
To answer your question, Don, and do you want to go first, Pam, or?
Well, I want to make sure I understood the question. By nature of the definition of slavery, there wasn't a lot of choice. I mean, you did what you were told, or you got killed, or you got your body mutilated or something. I think it was more survival, sort of survival of the fittest, survival even now of maneuvering around systems that may have systemic discrimination. You learn how to maneuver a system, no matter what it is, as part of your survival, I grew up in a home, obviously, sort of like Reverend here, that my mother said, you're going to get a job or you're going to college, so what you going to do, right? And so it was like, you better go to college, And so you have to have those high expectations of your own children, regardless of race, You have to expect. If you don't expect, you're not going to get, And then just to keep encouraging them, you know, to go higher in their goals and their education. I think education makes a big difference. I think the history books are inaccurate, and it would be nice to have some good history books, you know,
They're lies.
in the library or in the schools. And then that would help even to for more communication about really the real history of what happened. And then people can come up with solutions. Because right now we're dealing with a lot of stereotypes and myths about each other, and we don't know each other unless we get to be friends and sit down and talk and know each other as human beings. And that's mainly what my barber was telling me, and he's about my daughter's age, but he was saying, you know, well, it'd be nice if people could just be human, you know, and treat each other like human beings in the way they want to be treated. Well, isn't that what Jesus told us to do, you know? You know, love your neighbor as yourself. So if we could just get the church to step up and exercise what they profess to believe, you know, loving God with all their heart and soul, you know, loving your neighbor as yourself, and then walking it out, taking the time to try to listen and understand another perspective like you all are doing tonight. You know, I have to give you great credit. I mean, I've tried to talk to some congregations don't even want to talk about it, you know, and some families don't want to talk about it. And even just doing a DNA search of your family history, you'll get to the elders and they will not talk about certain things in the past. They won't say where they came from. You know, that's just a holdover, you know, because, oh, I'm running away, so I don't want anyone to catch me. So every time I cross a state line, I change my last name. I ran into a lot of that, you know, just trying to even find history in, you know, in my own family. But then again, we just respect each other and treat each other like humans. I think we've lost that. And the church is segregated. Most of the churches are segregated on, you know, how are we going to learn each other if we stay segregated? You know, I wanted to leave with everyone 2 Chronicles 7:14. If we don't come together and humble ourselves and pray and see God's face, we're never going to find the answer to any of these questions. But to come together even in prayer, that would be a good first start. What you're doing tonight, that's a good first start. I think so.
And to further expand on your question, Don, I think a few things have to happen. First of all, I don't think that we have a problem with admitting that the great original sin of the United States of America was slavery. And when it comes to the issue of slavery, were there some who over time bought into inferiority? And I would say yes, because it does come down to survival. And we have to remember that slavery was not something that happened in the United States for a short period of time. On the American continent for a short period of time. It was 400 years. And so over time, after generation after generation is raised in that setting, you do start to believe that you are inferior to the master because you have been taught that you are inferior to the master. And so did that bleed over into African American community after the end of slavery? And the answer to that, once again, is yes, because it came down to a survival mechanism. One of the big issues, especially even into the 70s and 80s, was that grandparents and parents would encourage some of their children to have lighter skinned children and to change their hair and what's used in the Black community is to pad. So yes, that was there. But I also believe that over time, within the Black community, when you had parents and grandparents such as myself and such as Reverend Lee had, that it shifted to, you are not going to use, no, you're not inferior, you're just as good, and you're not going to use that as an excuse. If you were to ask me, were that the case today? Maybe, among a very, very, very small group of people, but for the most part, I would say today that is not the case, in my opinion.
if I may chime in just briefly, two little things. Don and Carol, particularly, I think a great example is, not to name drop or try to sound smart, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Probably one of, if you could pick one book to read that's non-Christian, man, he's awesome. Went through World War II internment camps, and he talks a lot about in that book how many of his Jewish friends and family and how they changed while they were in concentration camps. And under that massive amount of stress, some of the Jewish friends became even more malicious than the SS guards who were there to guard them and to cattle them and shadow them and execute them. Some of the Jews that were promoted from their own community became even more vile than the German soldiers. And there were some people who just gave up, committed suicide, did the best they could do to basically shred themselves and give up on life because they just felt there was no way out. And he goes on to explain like a variety of human responses to that kind of violent oppression. And I think there's legitimate, at least plausible to say, okay, that might have been similar over that 400-year experience, where some Black people used it as motivation and they said, okay, I'm going to fight against this. Some Black people turned on their own and became like, well, if I can move up by somehow siding with the white man, then I'm going to look out for my own good. I think there's some people who became desperate and just unwilling to try, lost all kinds of hope. I think there's a variety of human responses to violent oppression, regardless of the color of your skin, So do that with what you will. And I think, not to sound like I have some kind of insight, but Miss Coe, I would challenge you on the fact that you don't have the right, or that you're not suitable to answer the question. I think that has come to light in our culture today. Like, well, if you're not Black, you can't speak on Black issues. If you're not a woman, you can't speak on feminine issues. If you're not a white male, there's no way you can speak on white male issues. I think you would have wonderful insight, Sharon, on your perspective on Black America. It would be very unique and very helpful to this discussion, even though you're not a Black American. Even in my experience working in colleges for the last 20 years and working with a lot of African Americans and Black Americans, I think there's a very distinct difference there, a very distinct difference, and one that I think we would do well to know. African Americans that I've worked with typically have a very poor perspective of Black Americans. And it's interesting to hear, 3 families just this last year, I sat down with them and they were blatantly honest with me. Black Americans don't have respect for women. Black Americans like to basically hurt themselves with drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Black Americans don't take advantage of the educational opportunities that are set before them. Black Americans use their race as an excuse. And these are African American people telling me this. Families being very vulnerable and honest with me, saying, I'm from Nigeria, I'm from Ethiopia, I'm from these West African countries. I've come here, I'm the 2nd generation. I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've been responsible with this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And my observation of Black America is X. And they were honest enough to come at me with some not easy things to hear. But they were like, this is what we see as Africans who immigrated here willingly. And matter of fact, they didn't like being called Black Americans. They almost took it as an insult. And that was hard for me to hear. But they were honest enough to tell me, hey, Rashawn, or they called me Coach Austin. I had some of their students as basketball players. This is what we see as Africans from West Africa or from African countries. This is what we see in Black America today. So I'd encourage you with discretion and intentionality and diplomacy and tact if necessary. But I would say, hey, because you're Asian doesn't mean you don't have a good, valid, needed perspective on any question that's asked tonight. I just encourage you with that. Anyone for that matter. Anyone for that matter.
Yeah, I received that. Thank you.
Well, I don't mean to be hogging. I'm kind of watching the chat and I'm not seeing anyone pipe in, or Janice has something in there, but I can beat up Janice. I'm not worried about that. You know, I grew up in a very poor community within half a block of the very poor Black community. It was almost like here in Kansas City, Troost, 13th Street in Kansas City, Kansas was kind of the Black-white dividing line. And so I grew up very close to 13th Street and had lots of Black friends and lived with the Black community. I always felt like, for the most part, they had their heads down, defeated, whooped. I felt horrible about that. And maybe I wasn't understanding, and maybe I was reading it wrong, but that's how I saw it. And you know, as a white man, I cannot comment about the Black community, even though I grew up with a lot of those people. I can't even get my head around that, let alone. So I don't see that now, I don't think. That's why I asked the question. You know, I love the story of the, what is it, Africa town. It's in maybe Connecticut or something. The slaves that were brought over and were totally subservient. And as soon as they were set free, they went and built a new town just like their other one. So it's like they were carrying with them the spirit of being Nigerian or Black people. But they didn't allow that spirit while they were in slavery. That's just something that has bothered me.
I'm gonna bring us one more question before we run out of time this evening as well. I do want to read this statement, and I want to bring a question to you panelists. One writes, maybe it's the lack of church stepping up to be the leadership of what we want. With so many different groups promoting change, some of them are making real gains at the local level for accountability. So you can reflect on that. But the question to go along with that, you know, what do you think that the white church can do to take on injustices or to be helpful in this process of racial reconciliation? Or what can we do to partner together as diverse churches to make a difference, a positive difference in our communities?
So I'll jump in. I think we're at a unique point in time in history in our country. There's a lot of things that have made 2020 stand out, and some of them good, some of them not so good. I can certainly speak best for my organization, but the opportunity to have conversation about racism, or to have conversation about acting in ways that are not racist, or even to be proactive about calling out racism. I don't think international ministries, you know, amongst its personnel would have initiated the conversation on our own had it not been for what's going on in the world around us, in the country around us. It's on a smaller scale, it's been very positive because many of my colleagues have found an opportunity to have a voice, and others around them have said, look, please tell us the stories we don't know. And we don't know what we don't know. You know, we're saying things, we're being insensitive, you know, please point it out. You know, we want to hear it. And, you know, some of it stings, you know, if it's something you didn't want to hear about yourself or something you had done. But it's been so rich and so important for learning as a learning community. And I think, you know, the one thought I have about this group, it looks like it's about 30 or so people on my screen. We're all here. I mean, there's other things we could be doing with our Wednesday evening. You know, we could all be watching TV or something. But friends, you chose to be in a conversation knowing what it would be about. And I think that's pleasing in God's sight. So certainly the listening and the encouraging of stories and the exchange of stories and the choice to not get defensive quickly, in the workplace, of course there's the urge to say, but that's not what they meant. It's like, no, let's just, as I told some of the senior staff, look, for some of our friends, this is the first time they felt safe having a voice. I think in this moment in history, let's just let them talk. Everybody kind of, they stopped calling out counterexamples and different, no, I'm not a racist. And that's kind of where I got the phrase, we don't all wake up in the morning and think I'm a racist, but let's let the stories challenge us. That's what Christ would call us to. So I'll let someone else talk.
I would say that there needs to be an ability to listen, and for people in the minority communities to assume good intent. It's really important. I'll use I know Don. He lives across the street from me. I know his heart. And the fact of the matter is that if I were someone else, to just hear him say that he lived in a community and he looked at the African American community and saw them as defeated, there would be people who would take offense to that. But it's not made as an offensive statement. It's made as a statement of, I was a child and this is what I saw. So on the one hand, we have to assume good intent. And I would just ask that with my white and European friends to just listen and understand that our experience is our reality. When I was in Greensburg, I said we were there doing Ferguson, and one of the questions came up around law enforcement, and that's because in Greensburg, everybody knows law enforcement. I knew the sheriff. The sheriff lived right around the corner from me. If my boys were teenagers and he pulled them over for something that they got in trouble with in Greensburg, you know what happens? He gets on the phone, he says, "Hey, Franklin, I pulled over your boy, come and get him." In Wichita, that's not what happens. And the reality of the situation in the world today is I have a 8-year-old son, and Pastor Jessica has a son that's a year older. The reality of the world is if those boys were 11 years older and they're driving down the street in Kansas City or in Wichita or in Topeka or in Detroit and they're pulled over, my little son, I mean, he's a little fella, is going to be perceived as a greater threat than Pastor Jessica's son. And that's the reality that we live in. And I would say just hear us. And then once you hear us, now the hard work comes from me and my community and everyone else is to say, why is that? And what can we do to fix it? So the first thing is just to listen and to not get defensive on either side, and to realize that the reality we speak to is real for us. That situation for me as a Black man is probably the most scary situation for me. Not because of myself, I don't worry about me, but I like I said, I've got 3 boys, and I do worry about them in that particular type of situation.
I may interject. Now I think Reverend Ruff has clarified the issue from our first question, maybe inadvertently so. Talk about the first question that was written, the struggles, deterioration, or continuation. He pinpointed one of the, I would say, if we're looking at archery and looking at a target, that's close to a 9 or a 10. The presumed negative intention of many people towards Blacks, and even Blacks towards Blacks. We'd have to ask the question really hard in Black America, what have we done to promote, to establish, and even to some degree, this is really hard to hear, especially for Black Americans, hear it from other Black Americans, how have we even promoted it at times for our own advantage? Again, working in colleges for 25 years now, mostly in rural small towns, I get a kid comes from upscale, 5-bedroom, 3.5 baths, 5 cars, vacation home in Tahiti, Black kid doing really, really well, has never known a gang, never known hard times. He comes to middle of Kansas, nowhere, all of a sudden he's hard, rough and gruff, gangster, talking all this kind of lingo, got his hat cocked to the side. I'm like, bro, what? Your mama bought you that BMW. You don't know anything about the hood. But all of a sudden, he comes to this little small town, and what does he do? He adopts the rough, rugged kind of gangster profile because he feels like he can use it to his advantage. He can scare people. He can look hard and act all hard because there's this negative, not from everyone. Let's just use kind of the Pareto principle, 80-20, kind of in general, there's typically more of, let's say, Reverend Ruff, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe at the very least, more of a negative perception towards Black males than non-Black males in certain situations, where it's being pulled over, where there's walking down the street and there's 4 Black kids on one side of the street, 4 white kids on one side of the street. There's a lady on the Black by herself when the Black kids are walking down and she crossed the street. Negative like intent. Like, wow, I see that group of Black kids and I have this automatic kind of like, ooh, maybe that's bad. I think Reverend Ruff, you hit on the issue, and I think it hits both sides of the fence, even though it's broader than just Black and white, as Ms. Coe clearly has shown us. Well, why is it that we have on, say, the Black side of the fence, why are we unwilling to look at ourselves and say, what have I done to promote this negative, this assumed negativity or negative intention towards my own race, and how have I prostituted it and used it to my own advantage by trying to adopt or inherit some kind of hardcore gangster, like, yeah, you better step out of my way because I'm gonna do X, Y, Z, and use that to my advantage. And why is it that maybe non-whites, even African Americans versus Black Americans, why do we presume negative intention very often, or a higher degree of maybe maliciousness to many Black Americans? And I think now we're kind of getting a little closer to the target as far as struggles, continuation of struggle, race relations. I think we're getting a little closer to the issues if we're trying to pinpoint them.
Well, and I wish we were able to hit the bullseye, but the thing that we were trying to do tonight, and I hope we've accomplished this, is to have a conversation. Let's listen. Let's hear each other. Let's understand that this issue of race, first of all, is not just a Black and white issue. There are, and it's an issue that hurt everyone. We are all less because of this. And so we within the body of Christ want to fix it. So what we're going to do now, we're going to have one final question. This question will go to everyone on the panel. We will answer it in the same order that we spoke originally. So you can go about answering that question. And then if you want to have a few minutes for a final statement, please do so. And then we'll close out. So Pastor Jessica, the final question.
Okay, as we wrap up, based on what you see going on in the world today, are you hopeful or are you pessimistic about the future?
I think I went first, so I'll jump in. I am hopeful. I hope I'm an incurable prisoner of hope, as Scripture says, and that with my eyes on the future as belonging to God in God's coming kingdom, desired among us, and all of us working together for that, that I'm incredibly hopeful. You said final remarks. Friends, I think being here together tonight and even having this conversation is a hint of God's coming kingdom. So thanks for being here.
Oh, okay. I guess in closing, I would say we did have success doing unity in our community as a project where churches reached out or partnered with other churches at their own choosing, okay, to either do a project in their community or just to get together and fellowship and have a musical, you know. So, but that had to be left totally to that. Those churches had to be willing to come together and do that, because the intensity of the whole situation is most of our churches are still segregated. So you have to basically reach out, and it takes effort and it takes being prayed up, you know, don't get your feelings easily hurt, you know. uh, and just go to some pastors in your community and say, hey, let's do a community project together or something. Let's do something that helps bring unity in the community, not just even just along racial lines, but just unity along human lines, being humans and treating each other with respect, and listening to each other. So there was some success with that. We kept it so open because we said you don't have to use the NAACP name. You don't have to share credit with anybody. This is your project. You make it up. You do it. You reach out to whoever in your community you think wants to help with it, whatever that might be. And so we didn't claim any ownership. Each church had their own ownership, came up with their own program, did their own thing. Some of them went on TV, some didn't. So and then since I did work with the media, just to leave you a thought on the media is a business, okay? And they go by ratings and they sell advertising. And if you want your issue on the news or in a talk show or something, you have to frame that issue. You have to approach the reporter. You have to report, someone that that works there, and you go to the newspaper or whatever, but you frame the issue. If you don't frame the issue, the media will frame the issue for you. And they're going to frame it based on their little perspectives, which is basically, I want to get an award-winning story so I can go to a bigger market, and I worked with a CBS affiliate, and that's how the business works, so I'm just saying the church going to have to take the lead to get the image you want. You're going to have to sell it, promote it. You're going to have to reach out to people and talk to them. If you don't frame the issue, someone else will frame it for you. And so you do have to get a little more aggressive with that piece of the marketing. For those of you all that do business, okay, that piece of here's what we're going to do, and this is for the image or whatever theme we're going to promote, and we're going to grab a couple of partners and we're going to do it, and it builds over time. You'll have more partners and stuff. So I guess I am hopeful because I have seen it work, and I would just encourage y'all to keep doing the same thing, keep talking to each other, and again, thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you for that, Miss Pamela, Reverend Lee. Even though I don't remember the question, that is an amazing piece of advice, framing the issue and making sure that we have a specific issue that we're framing and really, dare I say, control the narrative, as explosive as that word is. But yeah, very great sage advice there. Thank you, ma'am. Would anybody be willing to tell me what the question is?
Yeah, let me restate the question for you. Based on what you see in the world today, are you hopeful or are you pessimistic about the future? And then whatever closing statement you want to make.
Oh, wow. I'd say I'm hopefully pessimistic. Christ is going to burst through and do what he does, and hopefully we'll be faithful stewards of whatever is set before us. Man, the enemy is afoot, and he's just really good at what he does. It's dumbfounded me since, I want to say, about 8th grade, when this kind of nugget landed on me. I thought, wow, Satan is really good at what he does, in the sense that he takes something that's out of our control. Like, I never chose to be born caramel colored. I got hate from other Black people because I was too light. Satan uses something that none of us had control over, whether we're born of Asian descent, African American descent, European descent, Aboriginal, whatever. None of us had control over that. Yet the enemy is so good at what he does that he has caused maybe the most amount of oppression, death, and killing through deceiving us into killing each other based on something we can't even control. Like, we had no control over the tone of our skin, what language we speak, our nativeness, nothing of that. But the enemy has convinced us that those differences are worth killing each other over. And I had no control of being different from anyone else. I mean, I'm hopeful in the sense that, Christ is going to do his thing. We know the victory is already won. We know the end of the story. But man, it's an uphill climb as far as I think on our end. So I'd say I'm hopefully optimistic, and hopefully, or whatever I said before, like pessimistically optimistic or pessimistically hopeful. I'm thankful to be a part of hopefully the solution versus further dysfunction. Let's put it that way. And from what I've seen, I'm really a person who focuses on one man at a time. You know, I heard that a lot coming up because I was kind of not the normal Black person. Well, why do you speak so plainly? And why don't you have an accent? And why don't you wear your pants down? And why don't you do da 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 da? Are you sure you're Black? Blah 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 blah. And I'd always hear stuff like, well, don't you feel responsible to lift other people up? And what does that look like for you, Rashawn? And I've always said, and I still hold on to this today, I said, it's one person at a time. It's one person at a time. Can I listen? Can I hear? Even hearing Don say that he can't even talk about certain issues, like that hurts right here. That he feels like he can't say certain things or maybe speak vulnerably about Black issues or about things he might feel because he might be labeled as, he didn't say this, but I would imagine, sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, but he did specifically say, I can't talk or I can't say because of something that might come his way by saying such things. I think that's part of the dysfunction of our culture right now, is that people don't feel the freedom to express what's on their heart because of some response that might come that might hurt them as far as their job, might hurt them physically, might hurt their reputation. Because I think there's a lot of people out there who, if we would allow them the space and the freedom to share their confusion or to share what they sincerely think, man, and have a free and open, non-threatening, hey, you can say whatever, ask whatever, communicate whatever it is about Black Americans, about Asian Americans, about Jews, whatever, about white Americans, and I'm just gonna hear it. Even if it stings, I'm just gonna hear it. That goes a long way. And for me, that's one person at a time. One person at a time.
Excuse me for my interruption, but Rashawn, I just wanted to be sure that is not what I said. What I was feeling was I can't get into the head of an African-American person. I have no fear whatsoever talking about that to anyone or even in a public group. But as a white man, it's hard for me to get into your head and to understand and feel what you really need from me to make this work. Okay. That was my comment.
Well, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. I know there are a lot of people who do feel like they can't express their sincere held opinions out of fear of repercussions that might be severely negative. So as far as this discussion is concerned, I apologize for misrepresenting you. At the same time, I think that is an issue that we need to address because it negates the whole reason we're here. Transparency, vulnerability, acceptance, because that leads to understanding and unity. And as far as I'm concerned, hey, you're free to be and to speak your mind, and I'm going to hear it, even if it's tough to hear. You muted, brother.
Yeah, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I will close quickly. We are in the year of COVID. Portland is on fire. The two of the highest ranking African-American police officers, the chief of Seattle and the chief of Rochester, have been forced to resign. It is an election year and people are fighting in the Christian church, are saying that people need to be removed from the church because of their political beliefs. People are being beat up and shot because of their political beliefs. When you look at all of that, I am very hopeful because God is still on the throne. God is in control. I remember having conversations with my mother about the 1960s, and she would tell me, trust me, it's nowhere near as bad. I wasn't there, so I have to take her word for it. And there is still, we have to have hope. Our whole faith, our whole belief system is based on, we are a people of hope. So yes, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that life has its ups and downs, and for many people, we're in a down situation right now because of many things that are out of our control. But we are also we're the people of Christ, and so I can't help but to be hopeful. I often think of the psalm that says, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning," and that just reminds me that the sunrise always comes. We might be right now in the middle of a midnight time, but the sun will rise. So yes, I'm very hopeful for our communities. I'm very hopeful for our race relations in our country. I'm very hopeful for the future. Uh, if nothing else, I know Jesus is coming back eventually. So that's where I am. I want to thank all of you for coming, for showing up for this conversation on racism and reconciliation in America. I want to also let you know that we as a staff here at First Baptist Stillwell have decided that we're going to have conversations about important issues on a quarterly basis. Our next one is planned for December, and we're going to talk about the importance of academia in the church moving forward. So what role is academics going to play in the church moving forward as churches are no longer able to afford full-time pastors, more pastors are bivocational. That'll be a little bit lighter conversation than what we have today, but we are planning on having some much more difficult conversations moving into 2021, and we hope that you would join us for those as well. I want to personally say thank you to Reverend Cole and to Pastor Lee and to Pastor Austin. And Pastor Austin, the best of luck on the nuptials coming up soon and the ready-made family. May there be blessings for you and your family. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and may God bless you as we continue to move forward. And I would just encourage you to continue to have this conversation. With that, we are going to dismiss in prayer, and we will have you all move on. Pastor Jessica, would you pray for us, please?
I'd be happy to. Would you pray with me? Holy God, we are grateful to be in this space this evening. Lord, we give you thanks, we give you praise that you are among us. God, we ask that you would be with us as we depart, that you would go with us to our different spaces. Lord, that you would help us to continue to think, to reflect, to see with your eyes the places in our own spaces and communities, God, where we can be at work, where we can make a difference for your kingdom, where we can come together in unity, and where, God, we can lift others up. God, where we can be about your work of reconciliation, lifting up all who are imagers, God, recognizing that we are the image of God. Lord, we just thank you and we praise you for this time and ask that you would go with us as we depart. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.